welcome to meeting number 9 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Pursuant to the motion adopted on Tuesday, February 8th, the committee is meeting on the review of the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Before I begin, we're going to condense the panels slightly to two 45-minute panels. We just have some housekeeping at the end of the meeting, and I'll keep 20 to 30 minutes for that at the end. So hopefully everyone's okay with that. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Before I get you to start, I will each give each witness group 5 minutes. When you're at your last 30 seconds, whether you're being asked a question or in your time, I'll give a 30-second card. And when you're out of time, it's out of time. And I'm pretty generous usually, but I will have to end the conversation. And if you have the need to fulfill the question in one of the other questions when you get asked, just finish off your answer there, but be mindful of time. So for the first panel, we have Melissa Lukings, Juris Doctorate and author and researcher as an individual. We have from the BC Coalition of Experimental Communities, Susan Davis, Director. And from the Center of Gender and Sexual Health Equity, we have Dr. Shira Goldenberg, Assistant Professor, and Dr. Andrea Cruci, Assistant Professor, Department of Medicine from UBC. So each group will have 5 minutes. So beginning with Melissa Lukings for 5 minutes.
Hi, thanks for having me. I think I may have moved my microphone a little bit. If I need to move it again, just let me know.
Just move it a little bit up. The ideal position apparently of the mic is between your lips and your nose. That's the height-wise. Yeah, that looks good. I've got
cool.
a thumbs up from our interpreters.
Hey, all right. Hi, I'm Melissa Lukings. As was just said, I just finished my law degree, a Juris Doctor from UNB Law. I have a BA from Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. All of my education, so 2 degrees as well as life expenses, has been paid for entirely via sex work. In total, I have 14 now years of lived experience in sex work. That includes experience working in massage parlors, managing a massage parlor, operating an advertising website, as well as years of independent work. In terms of scope, it spans Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland and Labrador. While completing my law degree, and prior to that as well, I've been actively involved in sex work research and advocacy across Canada, specifically with the Safe Harbour Outreach Project in Newfoundland, Safe Space in London, Ontario, as well as the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. With respect to exploitation, I have had experiences in sexual exploitation which overlapped with but were distinct from my experiences in sex work, so I will speak to that as well. I have completed the sex trafficking and sexual exploitation course offered by the Trauma Institute of Arizona. And I also volunteered with the Sexual Assault Crisis and Prevention Center in Newfoundland as well. I want to highlight the timeline. So I started out in sex work in 2008. Between 2008 and, this way because your camera's up, between 2008 and 2014, when the Bill 36 went into effect, that's 6 years. So then from 2014 to 2020, when COVID happened, so work slowed, that is also 6 years. So I have 6 years before that year in between, and then 6 years after. So to put it in context, I was a sex worker before Bedford. I was a sex worker after Bedford, but pre-Bill C-36. I've been a sex worker after Bill C-36. I have experienced sexual exploitation. I can speak to the legal issues through the lens of advocacy, lived experience in sex work as an employee, an employer, an advertiser, and an independent. That does make me a third party, as well as lived experience in exploitation, again, which is separate from the sex work. Very quickly, I just wanted to talk about what an expert witness is. So before meeting everyone today, I did a little bit of I'm not going to call it a deep dive, just a light dive into everyone's background. The majority of you seem to be law folk. So I want everyone to think back for a moment to those law school days when you were first learning about evidence. It's a required course for us. I assume it's required for everyone. Great class. Remember evidence? In evidence, you learned what qualifies someone as an expert witness. So we're talking about unbiased perspectives, peer-reviewed, right? Published, lots of list of qualifications. There are some issues with finding qualified expert witnesses for vulnerable communities. We've had that be a thing in the past. I wrote a paper on it. It's included in my brief, which you guys will get later. Where does Paul Brandt fit into this? I can't not say it, right? Like, I don't get it. I don't know who invited him. After my background investigation, I do have some suspicions, but whoever it was needs to refresh their memory of relevant evidence and expert witnesses, because a country musician involved with an anti-trafficking group has nothing to do with providing meaningful insight into how laws impact sex workers in the country. It doesn't make any sense. When you have an expert witness, there's someone who's supposed to provide experience and insight which cannot be intuited without their testimony. I think that was a waste of time, and it made me sad that he was invited before I was, because we both applied. Anyway, so I want to give you a metaphor. You're tasked with hanging a poster on a vital community bulletin board. To accomplish this, you're given a few thumbtacks. Simple enough. However, rather than using your thumb to press the tacks into the board, you decide to bring in your gas-powered, heavy-duty reverse engine hammer drill from home. Do you get the tacks in the board? Well, yes, sure. However, in the process of doing so, that gas-powered heavy-duty reverse engine hammer drill also ended up fracturing the frame of the bulletin board, effectively breaking it. As a happy bonus, you also ended up causing extensive structural damage to the wall behind it. Will you be getting any gold stars for this assignment? No, you will not. No one's going to be handing out any gold stars to you for damaging the community's bulletin board, no matter how far you bashed that tack into the board before it broke and fell off the wall. Perhaps did your method of completing the task end up creating a scope of impact much wider than you had intended? It seems so. I feel certain saying that if the assignment you're given is to hang a notice on a bulletin board using thumbtacks, you break the board entirely. No one's giving out gold stars. So let's talk about these laws. Do they target human trafficking and sexual exploitation? Yes, just like we targeted the notice on, the tax in the board.
Unfortunately, Ms. Lukings, your 5 minutes is up. You're going to have to try to bring it up in the questioning. So I apologize for that.
Okay.
And I will advise again to the rest of the panelists. I'll try to waive this. You just got to pay attention to it. Next, Suzanne Davis from BC Coalition of Experiential Communities.
Good morning. Thank you for hearing me today. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the 3 great nations of Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. For the purpose of this testimony, I represent the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities, which is a sex worker-led advocacy and research group. I myself am a sex worker of 36 years, if you can believe that. I sometimes have a hard time believing it, but it's true. I will start by assuming that you've read my brief and understand that some of the information you've been receiving as evidence in the committee is false and would not qualify as evidence in a court of law and would not meet the test of the Tri-Council policy statement. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have in that regard. I will instead focus today on recommendations that could ensure that your work is complete and can achieve the best outcomes in supporting health, safety, and choices for adult consensual sex workers in Canada. First, with health. The Canadian government report to UNAIDS in 2016 clearly identifies the need to remove laws which criminalize sex work. Canada also has international obligations to address the criminalization of people who are vulnerable to HIV and AIDS, and I quote, "Laws, such as laws on sex work, may discriminate by criminalizing conduct or identity. States have a moral and legal obligation to remove discriminatory laws and to enact laws that protect people from discrimination." This committee heard from Justice Canada about arrest numbers and difficulties experienced by police and prosecutors in targeting exploitation. This committee must also hear from the Minister of Health, the Public Health Agency of Canada, Corrections Canada, International Affairs, and all those responsible for the federal initiative to address HIV/AIDS in Canada. The impacts of criminalization on the health of sex workers and Canada's international commitments at the UN are critical to your work. Now for the law. Canadians and witnesses here are all in agreement that sex workers should not be criminalized. Police and prosecutors have expressed confusion on how to fight exploitation. They state that human trafficking laws are insufficient and often risk a victim's safety. The use of prostitution laws has become the default in absence of effective human trafficking legislation. There are many laws that can be used to fight violence against sex workers without defaulting to prostitution laws. Victims of human trafficking exist in many industries, not just sex work. You've heard about exploitation of youth and children. The stigma carried by sex work also extends to youth who experience paid sexual exploitation. A child whose exploiter is charged under prostitution laws will be subjected to the prostitute stigma for the entirety of their lives. People migrating to Canada, fleeing economic hardship, climate change, discrimination, and many other things also face risks if they engage in sex work. They could be deemed inadmissible and subject to deportation if they are discovered. This makes it impossible for migrant sex workers to report violence when they experience it or to access health services without fear. In spite of misrepresentations and false information given to this committee, the most successful examples of protecting sex worker health and safety are in places which have decriminalized sex work. Part of the New Zealand Prostitution Reform Act purpose is protecting sex workers and children from exploitation. On the 22nd of February, just over 1 month ago, the state of Victoria in Australia decriminalized sex work also for the rights and safety of sex workers and preventing exploitation. Canada must meet its international obligations and address these issues by repealing PSEPA in its entirety, repealing the IRPR sections 1831B1 and 196.1A, and considering additions to section 279.01 of the Criminal Code to better counter the exploitation of or human trafficking of a person, ensuring additions to that law are based in fact and written in consultation with all stakeholders, and lastly, implementing a national policing policy and guidelines highlighting sex worker rights and the changes to the Criminal Code. The truth is, we are working class people, citizens and newcomers who are simply trying to feed and house ourselves and our families. Comments made in support of laws against being near churches, schools, and parks are hurtful and totally discriminatory. We have families. Our children go to school. We are diverse in our spiritual beliefs. Children are not prostitutes. We should not be subjected to the narrow ideology of a very vocal few. Sex workers who are migrating should not be deemed inadmissible. Police are asking for more effective tools in fighting exploitation. Please work with us to meet Canada's obligations to sex workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. I'll next go over to the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity, and between Dr. Goldenberg and Dr. Crucy, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting Dr. Goldenberg and I for the hearings of today. We're both assistant professors at the University of British Columbia Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity in Vancouver. I'm here to speak to our empirical research on the occupational health and safety impacts of PSEPA that was summarized in our brief. Our longitudinal research project was initiated in 2010 and is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the US National Institutes of Health. The project includes qualitative research of the lived experiences of sex workers and third parties and an epidemiologic cohort of over 900 cis and transgender women sex workers across diverse work environments in Metro Vancouver. As a rigorous, prospective, mixed method study, our research is uniquely positioned to empirically evaluate the impact of the PSEPA on sex workers' occupational health and safety. We draw on longitudinal data collected with the same participants prior to and after the implementation of the PSEPA in December 2014. To our knowledge, this is the largest and most rigorous research available evaluating the health impacts of the PSEPA. This research highlights the ways in which the PSEPA reproduces the harms of previous legislation deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Canada. Of note, findings from our study were submitted as evidence in the Bedford case as well. I'm now going to very briefly summarize the main findings of our research, all of which has been peer-reviewed and published in highly reputable scientific journals. We found that after the implementation of the PSEPA, 72% of participants reported no changes in their working conditions and thus continued to work under unconstitutional and unsafe working conditions. Concerningly, 26% reported experiencing negative changes. The most common negative changes reported included reduced ability to screen clients and negotiate terms of transactions, which are essential for consensual sexual transactions. Immigrant sex workers were significantly more likely to report negative changes. Our research indicates that sex workers continue to face significant barriers to reporting violence to police. This is despite the objective of the PSEPA to encourage the reporting of violence, as stated in the preamble. In analysis of access to justice over 9 years, rates of reporting violence did not improve post-implementation of PSEPA. Only 26% of sex workers who experienced violence reported it to police, and a staggering 87% of racialized immigrant sex workers and 58% of Canadian-born sex workers did not report violence to police. Our research also highlights the negative effects of the criminalization of clients and the communication provisions. Key mechanisms by which criminalization and targeting of clients impact sex workers' working conditions identified by our research include barriers, again, to screening clients and negotiate terms of transactions, and displacement to isolated areas. Our research, in line with other important Canadian research by Professor Bruckert, debunks important myths around the role of third parties. While our research demonstrated that third-party security and administrative supports are linked to improved access to occupational health and safety, results showed that after the implementation of the PSEPA, there was a 31% reduction in odds of accessing third-party supports for sex workers. Finally, our research indicates that after PSEPA, sex workers experienced a 41% decrease in access to health services and a 23% reduction in odds of accessing community-based services. So in conclusion, public health evidence from Canada and internationally is unequivocal. Criminalization of sex work undermines sex workers' occupational health, safety, and rights. Prohibitionist scholars argue that sex work normalizes violence and gender inequalities. However, the public health literature suggests that it is in fact criminalization which achieves this by undermining sex workers' working conditions, restricting access to justice, and reinforcing the marginalization of all already marginalized sex workers, including those who are Indigenous, those who face immigration policy restrictions, and those who work in street-based settings. And thus, our evidence points to the full repeal of all provisions of the PSEPA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krusi. I will now start the panel of questioning, beginning with Mr. Brock for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses for your participation and attendance today. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Lukings. I know that you had much to say, and unfortunately your 5 minutes ran up pretty quickly. That's usually what happens in this format. So I've got 6 minutes. Would you be able to complete your summary in a minute or less? I see your head shaking, so I'll give you that opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to talk about how exploitation is about the relationship between parties, but not the relationship between the sex worker and clients. It's actually the relationship between the sex worker and a third party. Often this overlaps with domestic violence cases. So the actual solution, if we want actionable solutions to this, which we do, the only answer is to repeal all of the PSEPA, all of it, and then implement the offense for coercive control, which I believe was tabled today, either last night or today. And that's to criminalize the coercive control of another person, which targets exploitative behavior. We already have the trafficking laws and the sexual assault laws. So decrim plus coercive control allows us to actually hit the nail on the head, and we're not harming other people. So we're fixing the issue, helping those who need the help without harming others. Hey.
Thank you. So I want to start off by asking you some questions, Ms. Lukings. First, I want to congratulate you on your recent graduation. As you've indicated, you have done a bit of a dive with respect to our backgrounds. You'll probably note that I come from experience of 30 years in lawyering, the last 15 of which have been as a Crown prosecutor. I've taken some great pride in dealing with numerous human trafficking cases involving children, involving adults, dealing with other child exploitation offenses, not so much on prostitution, but there is an intersection between the trafficking component and prostitution under the current legislation. So one thing I wanted to address, and you spent some time talking about experts in general. And I'm going to use these words. These are my words, whether you agree with it or not. You're very critical of Mr. Brandt's testimony. We have heard from, as you know, we have heard from numerous witnesses, and I can assure you that none of them have been qualified in the traditional sense of being an expert witness. This is not a court of competent jurisdiction. It has not meant the legal definition of what an expert should bring to this particular committee. But everyone that we have heard from, in cases such as yourself, have brought not only an academic perspective to things, but a lived experience. So in Mr. Brandt's case and his defense, he can speak well on his own behalf. His evidence was helpful to us in the sense that it enabled us to get a full picture of the pros and the cons of this particular legislation. So I know that ultimately you see no path forward other than a full repeal of PSEPA. And you also referenced some other aspect to something that's being introduced into the House either today or soon thereafter to offer some protection to workers. So ultimately, we have to, as a committee, we have to decide whether we are going to recommend that the act be given a further chance of seeing its strengths or its weaknesses, or to recommend changes, tweaks, amendments, things of that nature. So on that particular point, should this committee ultimately conclude that we are not going to repeal PSEPA, I'd like to get your perspective on your thoughts on what amendments or what sort of adjustments do you think we should be looking at to try to find a nice balance between reducing the overall demand, but also protecting the exploited?
Okay, so if we're not open, excuse me, to repealing all of it, well, I mean, you have the easy way out, which is to take away the most obvious harm. So that would be getting rid of the advertising provision, the communicating, the purchasing, procuring, and third-party material benefits. Those are the most obvious ones. There are some other issues with the PSEPA as well, but I mean, I think we can all agree that the basic sex work laws are the ones that are causing the most trouble. So material benefit, advertising, purchasing, communicating, procuring would need to be repealed for sure. I think that would be the most obvious answer. I had 6 years before and 6 years after, and I mean, I can attest to, I've never, prior to PSEPA, I hadn't known any of my peers to die. After PSEPA, we're at, I think, 7 or 8 now. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. If it's supposed to help and not harm people, then how come there are actually people dying for fear of reporting to police? I mean, these are huge issues, and we're talking about people's lives, right? So to me, the bare minimum is to repeal those main provisions, but the ideal situation, if you want the A+, is to decrim. Absolutely.
So my next area is from your own personal.
Unfortunately, Mr. Brock, your 6 minutes are up. I'll have to go
Thank you,
on to the
Chair.
next. For the next round of questioning, it'd be Ms. Dillon for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Ms. Davis. Can you please elaborate on the New Zealand model, particularly with respect to the improvement of health conditions of sex workers under their model? I understand there have been several parliamentary reports done, including in 2009. Would you be able to share your comments with the committee? And also, if you could table the executive summary to the committee, please. Thank you.
Sure. From what I have read of it, I am a layperson, as we all sort of are, working on these issues by default because I am a sex worker and it applies to me. My friends have also died. I'm with Melissa. This is not a joke for us. This is not about ideology. This is supposed to be about the safety of my community. And so this is why I struggle with some of this. But the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective worked really hard, worked with all stakeholders, including police, and came up with a legal framework which would work to not only protect people from exploitation and to try to ensure that business operators had the tools they needed to ensure that they were being fair in the way that they were treating their employees, all of those things, and came up with the Prostitution Law Reform Act. So in the time after that, shortly thereafter, there was a bit of a surge in numbers of registered massage parlors / brothels, whatever you want to call it. But that has sort of trailed off over time. Many people think it's easy to open up a sex industry business. It is not. It is grueling, horrible work with late hours. And by horrible, I just mean late hours, no time to cook for yourself, being tired all the time, those kinds of things. So it has trailed off a lot. And so there was an initial sort of surge in numbers of registered places, but that has trailed off a bit, as well as estimates of numbers of sex workers in New Zealand have become more clear, and initial estimates that they did have it was actually lower than what they thought. And the same thing applies with youth who are at risk for being engaged in sex work. They've had a lot of success with being able to be open with business operators and sex workers generally to find youth who are at risk, to be able to intervene before youth in those positions are being exploited. They've been also able to redirect resources towards better support for youth. I mean, in this country, we should know better than anyone else. We need to do better for youth, provide them with choices so they don't land in a situation where they feel like this is their only option. You know, there's been no discussion of that in relation to these laws. You know, it's only about if once they've been exploited, well, can we do a little prevention? And that's one of the things that I think is the most important and key about New Zealand, is that they're talking to one another. They're identifying issues as they arise and trying to deal with them as they go forward. Some municipalities, for example, have been really reticent to adopt the law in its entirety, and have created no-go zones and things like that, which works counter to the intention of the law and the purpose of the law, which is in part to prevent exploitation of sex workers and children in New Zealand. I hope that is a bit of an answer. It is quite a comprehensive report, so I will definitely table the executive summary for the committee to consider.
Actually, if you could just deposit the whole report, that would be better, I think.
Sure, no
so
problem.
we can get more information. And if I can ask you a follow-up question, please. What do you think will happen if we remove all criminal penalties related to sex work, including, do you think criminalizing sex buyers helps sex workers?
Certainly not. In screening my clients, which I'm very lucky, after 36 years, I have a large regular clientele base. And so for the most part, I know my clients. But that's the thing. If you can't screen clients and you're having a hard time finding clients, every client you see is a new person and you don't know what to expect from that client. So screening is almost impossible under this legal regime, if you will. They don't want to give their full names. They don't want to risk their families, jobs, lives, because in a screening process, because they're afraid of being captured by this law. So for the workers on street, it means you have to jump in the car and drive away before you can negotiate the terms of your employment. We used to be able to lean into the window of the car and see if they have a rape kit. Are they sober? Now you're already in the car and you're left to negotiate your way out. In terms of having clients come into my home, I want to know who they are before they come into my home. My home is the safest place, or massage parlors when I've worked there, because it's on my turf, but going to a hotel or a client's home remains extremely risky, as it was before the Bedford decision, which I gave evidence in that case. I've been doing this. I've been in this battle for 20 years this year, which is really sort of sad in a way. But I think that the criminalization of sex buyers is not helping the situation at all, as well as they are a critical ally in the fight against exploitation. The Vancouver Police will tell you during their operation, which netted 47 men who were attempting to buy from a youth, they had phone calls from clients saying, there's a youth advertising sexual services on Leo List, and trying to refer that youth, who was actually a police officer, to the counter-exploitation unit. So the clients are not these boogeymen.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Thank you, Ms. Dillon. Next,
you.
for 6 minutes, to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to continue with Ms. Davis. I'm not sure I have understood her position. If I do understand from what she's told us, she finds it very unfortunate that clients, the buyers of the services, be penalized. And let me just make an aside here. I've been warned several times that sex workers is a concept, a term that covers many people and includes the prostitute, but also the pimp, the person who, manages them, and also the driver, their protector. We don't necessarily want to apply the same rules to all of them. So if I may, Ms. Davis, I will use the word prostitute then, if I may, just so that without any afterthought, it's just to be clear what I'm speaking of. So from what I understand, the prostitute at present is not criminalized, but the client is. Ms. Davis, you're saying that perhaps this ban on clients should be withdrawn, given that that would allow prostitutes to talk with and to screen their clients before they're left alone with them. If we say that we decriminalize the purchase of sex services, what should be criminalized? What sort of ban should we keep on something?
That we really need to keep a ban on anything in this regard. Unfortunately, there is this 100-year-long stigma about sex work, a lot of myths and rhetoric that has been perpetuated, not unlike by some of the witnesses who have given false information here. The clients are not the boogeymen that they are made out to be, and honestly, by criminalizing them, you are not motivating them to report exploitation should they witness it. These guys are on the
Madame
front
Davis,
line.
c'est qu'on a très peu de temps et je veux juste m'assurer.
We have very little time. I'm really sorry. You did say that, so thank you. I understand that to your mind, we should simply decriminalize everything, withdraw all provisions that have any bans on anything regarding prostitution. Is that correct?
I think that we should listen to police and ensure that they have the tools they need under other legislation where they seem to be struggling. For
Si,
example,
Madame Davis, mais je me dois de vous interrompre. Désolé, j'avais ça.
So sorry. I've only got 6 minutes, so I am just going to slip in here. Thank you for your answer. Ms. Lukens, you told us about people who are afraid to turn to police officers. And you have colleagues or friends who have even died. This is terribly sad. And of course, no one is pleased to hear this. But in your opinion, Ms. Lukens, what should we do to prevent this? What should we do to stop this? Should we just make everything to do with prostitution legal, or the purchase of the services should be legal? Or what do you think? Just in 1 minute, what should be legal and what should remain illegal?
Possible, we need to repeal all of the PSEPA laws, all of them. And then, as I mentioned, there is a tabling of the coercive control offense, and that would allow us to refocus on the relationship rather than the work, because it's not about the relationship. You can work at McDonald's and be exploited when you go home either way. It's a domestic relationship issue in that case.
Mais pour la prostitution,
Yes, but for prostitution, yes, I do understand the matter of trafficking and other types of abuse. But regarding prostitution, you set up. Could we have this document? Perhaps we already have it, Chair. I haven't seen it.
Brief.
OK. Alors, est-ce qu'on peut l'obtenir, votre mémoire? Je ne l'ai pas eu.
We haven't gotten your brief yet. Have other members of the committee gotten it? I would like to receive it. Could you send it and have it translated in both official languages, though, and have it sent to us? Thank you very much, Ms. Lukens. Earlier, you mentioned a couple of sections. Is my time out, Mr. Chair? All right, I'm sorry. Yeah, so Ms. Lukens, a little earlier, I think you listed some provisions, some sections that you feel should be repealed. Could you send us that list of sections of the criminal code that you feel should be repealed?
Madame Lukens,
Ms. Lukens, last question. You have spent a number of years working as a sex worker, and I'd list, like, again, I don't mean to be unfair in any way. You were a prostitute, or you ran a brothel. What exactly was your role?
Many roles. So I worked for a while in massage parlors. So that would be as an employee of a massage parlor. I also was
vous
the
étiez
general
la
manager.
personne qui donne le massage?
So you were the person giving the massage, or you were like at the reception, or?
Alors,
No. Giving the massage.
Okay.
I was the sex worker.
Okay.
And then I also, for a while, there was a whole, anyway, it was in St. John's. So then I was the manager of a massage parlor while simultaneously working there. So I did hire people. We advertised. I created an advertising website when we were no longer able to use Backpage and Craigslist. I created a site. I think it matters that I didn't charge anyone to advertise on it. It was free and community run with volunteer moderators who were also within the community. So we had a safe advertising place.
Madame
and I
Lukens,
was the-
on n'a plus de temps, mais si je comprends,
We have so little time. I'm so sorry. But if I understand correctly, you were managing.
merci,
Thank you,
Monsieur le
Mr.
Président.
Thank you very much.
6 minutes. Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. And on the point of who is an expert witness, I think we have people with both lived and academic research experience today who would qualify as an expert under anybody's definition of who is an expert in this topic. I'd like to turn to Drs. Cruz and Goldenberg, and I want to ask, we've had many people saying, is the problem just certain provisions of PSEPA, or is it the overall framework? So from your academic research, what is it that causes the harm? Could we fix this by just changing a few things, or is it the overall scheme of PSEPA that causes the harms?
Maybe I'll jump in here. Thank you so much, Mr. Garrison, for the question. Yes, we very much agree with our colleagues that we think the overall framework is actually the problem. We do feel that this legislation, like many other similar pieces internationally and that have preceded it in Canada, are really based on this conflation of sex work with the idea of trafficking or exploitation that is very much based on stigmatizing beliefs and often inaccurate knowledge. And so from what we see in our evidence, really highlighting that the various provisions of the current law as it stands all create health inequity and barriers to safety and health access for sex workers. We very much agree with our colleagues that the full repeal of the law is really what we would advocate for. And I'll see if Dr. Krusi has anything they'd like to add to that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is really imperative to repeal all the provisions of the PSEPA, and that will give way to implementing occupational health and safety standards that can actually regulate the industry. That is something that was possible in the New Zealand context post decriminalization. And I have noticed that on your next hearings around the PSEPA, you have some really outstanding experts speaking from New Zealand, Professor Abel and Professor Lindsay Armstrong. And I think it will be really important to hear them speak about what was possible in terms of occupational health and safety guidance for the sex industry in the context of decriminalization. And I think that is a really important piece to think about. What can the reality of sex work look like post decriminalization, and what avenues of implementing occupational health and safety standards that will open up for different sectors of the industry. And these need to be, as in New Zealand, developed with sex workers in the driving seat at the table and based on empirical evidence.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Ms. Davis. We've often heard during these hearings from witnesses who say, if you define sex work, all sex work as exploitation, you miss the real exploitation. And if you define all sex work as violence, you miss the real violence. So Ms. Davis, how would you react to that statement from your experience?
I think that the Vancouver experience is very critical in this regard. And while our policing policy is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, what it has done is free up police resources to actually fight exploitation and not blanket target the entire industry, sort of throwing mud at the wall to see if they can find any human trafficking victims, as they did before the Olympics. Before the Olympics, there was a big push to fight human trafficking. They raided 68 health enhancement centers where there were all Asian sex workers there, found 0 human trafficking victims, detained and deported hundreds of women. 3 people from the Asian sex working community in Vancouver were murdered the following year. So the direct correlation is there. To me, I think that we need to take a step back from this and understand that exploitation does happen, and there has to be a way to work on it without throwing the rights of sex workers under the bus, which is illegal under the charter. You cannot undermine the rights of one group to save another. As well as with youth, I mean, they're not sex workers, they're exploited. And I think that this tag, this label, plays into our obligations at UNAIDS, where we're supposed to be removing those kind of discriminatory language, laws, all of those things. And so for me, I think that we need to, again, take a step back. And as all of my cohorts are saying, we need to work with sex workers towards a strategy that's going to ensure our health and safety, as well as to free up all these resources that are currently being used in horrible operations like Operation Northern Spotlight, which is a blanket action and is a waste of resources. If we really want to fight exploitation, we need to put our money where it counts and to work on strategies that have been proven in places to actually have an impact.
Thank you. I want to thank Ms. Lukings for making the connection between criminalizing coercive and controlling behavior and combating exploitation. It's something we actually hadn't done at this committee before, so I think it's a valuable contribution to our debate on that legislation. But I want to put the same question to you, Ms. Lukings. By blanket enforcement against the entire sex work industry, do we really miss real instances of tracking and real instances of exploitation?
Yes, absolutely. By criminalizing the whole sex work community, you're essentially eliminating all of your allies. I think someone already mentioned that. So where you would have sex workers report suspicious things in a decriminalized context, you're not getting that right now. Where you would have clients recognize red flags and be able to report things, you're not having that now. So these blanket enforcement laws are really just a waste of resources, which is really, really unfortunate because you're not actually targeting the issue that is being hidden. You're targeting what you can see. It's what you can't see that's the problem.
Thank you, Ms. Lukings, and thank you, Mr. Garrison. In the interest of time, I'm just going to, if it's okay, to condense the next two rounds to 2 3-minute rounds and 2 2-minute rounds, if that's okay with. So over to you, Mr. Cooper, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for your testimony. It's been very helpful and interesting. Ms. Davis, I'd like to address a question to you. At the end of your testimony, you said that Canada, in order to live up to its international obligations, should repeal PSEPA. And I would be interested in you elaborating a little bit on that, having regard for the fact that Canada signed the Palermo Protocol, which provides, among other things, that Canada adopt legislative measures that discourage the demand and adopt such legislative and other measures as may be necessary to establish as criminal offenses. So how does that square from the standpoint of repealing PSEPA? Because it would seem to me that that is precisely what PSEPA does, is what is in accordance with the Palermo Protocol, namely discouraging and targeting the issue of demand.
Well, I would say that the Palermo Protocol is actually under question in terms of whether or not it's actually legitimate under the UN, and that the WHO, the World Bank, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNESCO, the ILO, all of these parts of the UN have signed on to decriminalization and removal of laws that criminalize people who are vulnerable to HIV/AIDS. We have spent as a country over $2 billion at UN AIDS. We have signed on to this, to fighting AIDS across the planet. And frankly, I think that the Palermo Protocol, which is based out of the US, really has no place in this. And if it was to be looked at reasonably, would not be adopted again. I think that it needs to be revisited and that protocol is not helpful on any level.
Thank you for that. Looking at some of the statistics that are available before and after PSEPA, we have seen, for example, according to Statistics Canada in 2021, a decrease in reported injuries and homicides of sex workers. Moreover, before PSEPA, 43% of those accused of sex trade-related offenses were women. Today it is 93% men. What do you say to that? It would seem to me that that would evidence that PSEPA is working in large measure.
I would say that this is a reflection of, first of all, some bias on the part of police in that they're only looking for sex work as it relates to human trafficking. It's not as sexy and fun to go to a farm and see if the farm hands are being human trafficked. I would also say that we have not heard from health or the Public Health Agency of Canada in terms of what the numbers are related to risk of HIV or syphilis or other bloodborne infections.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Next for 3 minutes to Ms. Diab, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just want to say thank you for all our witnesses today in the panel. You've made excellent presentation. And quite frankly, we've been listening to this now for many weeks. I would have to say I've heard from you today. Your testimony today from me has shown a bit of a different and a better light, I would say, on this question. So I really want to thank you for all that. You're all, quite frankly, recommending decriminalizing, and you all know that we have issues in our society. We all know there's exploitation that happens and will continue to happen. There's trafficking, there's whatever. I want to get your feedback, perhaps Dr. Goldenberg or Dr. Krusi, in how can we combat these other issues, and what does it have to do with PSEPA, if anything? So I would like to hear that from you.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I think you raise a really important question. And from what we've seen in the public health literature and our own experience working with sex workers in the context of our research, it's really clear that the stigmas and the values that we hold as a society are very much shaped by public policy and public discourse. And so a law like this, what we've seen and what other scholars have shown as well, can actually fuel those sort of issues that you mentioned and the ways in which sex work can be singled out and conflated with trafficking. And so, when something is criminalized, it is seen as immoral, that there is something going on there that we need to be concerned about in a different way. Trafficking exists across any sectors. Exploitation occurs across all sectors of work. But when a type of work is pushed underground, that's when, reports around these things become impossible.
So other than fully decriminalizing, because we know sex workers from your testimony and others have challenges with doctors, with police, with the law, because of all of that. What would be a next step, I guess, other than totally decriminalizing the PSEPA?
I think, we'll be consistent in our advocacy for the repeal of the laws because of the framework that we feel underpins them and the challenges that they pose as a whole. However, if this committee is debating particular provisions, I would agree with our colleagues around the provisions around communication, advertising, the things that, pose barriers to working with supportive third parties. At the same time, though, the provisions around compliance are extremely complicated because, work led by Dr. Krusi, for example, participants quotes literally said, you criminalize the client, it's exactly the same thing as criminalizing the sex worker. So by failing to repeal that provision, we're actually sort of stating here that we are, wishing to perpetuate the previous laws that were struck down, because that's essentially, what the research showed that particular provision has resulted in. So I think it's a challenging question, but those are my perspectives based on the scientific evidence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Diab, and thank you, Ms. Goldenberg. Next, for 2 minutes each, Mr. Fortin.
Ma question, c'est
I have a question for Ms. Lukings. I was listening to your testimony. You were talking about decriminalization. If we decriminalize, if we take away the offenses that are already in the criminal code, should we be regulating, that is to say, establishing standards that sex workers would have to abide by?
I think that could be a good idea, but I think it's beyond really the scope of what we're looking at here. I know that the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform has already made suggestions about how decriminalization could work with occupational health and safety standards. That would be something to look at. For me specifically, I think just being able to have the normal human standards and laws apply would be really helpful, because it's just a job. And it would be really great if we could be seen as just a job.
And that means it would be up to the provinces to do so. So if I've understood you correctly, we should establish a framework within which the profession would be able to operate, if I can speak that way.
Would have to be developed with the people who are impacted. So that would be with the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, with the sex workers themselves. Again, because we'd be talking about an area that would be decriminalized. We would not be looking at exploitation or trafficking. So you would have to work with the sex work advocacy groups.
One last question. I'm sorry to be impolite. I hate to cut you off. Is there a difference between the different types of prostitution? For instance, I'm often told about prostitution at the end of the month so that they can buy food and so on for their kids, whereas in other cases, it's narco prostitution. They have drug addiction issues. Is there different types of prostitution that we should take into account in our work? And should these different types of prostitutions be treated differently?
Running into the same thing where it's just a job. Someone might take more shifts working at a bar to buy drugs or to pay for their kids or to buy bread or whatever. Like, it's just a job. What they're doing doesn't actually apply to whether or not there's exploitation happening. And these other things that you're bringing up, the drugs and the economic instability, these are pervasive in our society regardless of where someone works. So, I mean, is it related to sex work? Not really. It's about the relationships and the social conditions that we're already facing.
Thank you, Ms. Lookings. Thank you, Mr. Fortin. Last 2 minutes for Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cooper often asks questions that I think are good questions, even though we are often looking for different answers. And so I want to go back to his question about the stats, the official stats. And I want to go to our actual experts who have appeared as expert witnesses in court cases, Dr. Crucia and Dr. Goldenberg. And what is your comment on the argument that the stats show reductions after PSEPA?
I would agree with the statement that was made around concern around the bias and the folks that are represented in those numbers. So as was previously mentioned, our study involves 10 years of evidence and is a community-based study. We have sex workers on our team, sex workers collecting data, sex workers informing all aspects of the project, community advisory activities. And so we've worked really hard with the community to make sure that the research is representative of the experiences of the diversity of sex workers that operate across different types of venues in Metro Vancouver. Our statistics show a very different trend than what was presented by Statistics Canada. And so I think I would urge the committee to look at both and in particular consider the rigor of our evidence that it is peer reviewed. The Statistics Canada research is not, to the best of my knowledge. So these are studies that have been published in some of the most prestigious medical journals. Expert reviewers from all around the world look at the evidence, ensure that it's rigorous, and we feel very confident in the quality of our data and who it represents.
And I just want to add too that Statistics Canada does not capture people who do not report the violence, and our data does capture that. And I think that is very important. So we found that only 26% of sex workers who experienced violence actually reported it under PSEPA. And from qualitative research, we know the reasons why that is. And it is because of the continued criminalization. Sex workers are worried, even when police have their safety in mind, they're worried to report violence to police because they're worried that their reports will be used later on against them in enforcement efforts. In the context of continued structural stigma, sex workers feel that their violence reporting is not being taken seriously, and that sex work, because of the assumption that sex work is inherently dangerous and therefore it's getting minimized.
Thank you.
And in the context of immigration concerns, that's a huge barrier for people who have unstable immigration status to go forward and report violence. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cruci. I want to thank all the panelists for an excellent panel. You're very clear and precise, and I think the questions brought out a lot of great answers. So I want to thank you. You can probably disconnect, or the clerk will have you disconnect, and the next panel come on. Do you need me to suspend, or we're good? Yep. Okay.
Can we stay and watch?
Yes, you can stay and watch. Absolutely.
I'll just mute myself and watch. Yay. Yep. Thank you.
The next panel, we have Naomi Sayers, a lawyer as an individual. We also have Kelsey Smith, a neuroscience and mental health student at Carleton University. And we have Women's Studies Online, which is Sherry Smiley. So each will have 5 minutes. And as you notice, I will give a cue card when you have 30 seconds left, and then questions and after will occur afterwards. And we will try to end this at about 2:35 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for some housekeeping. So over to you, Ms. Naomi Sayers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee, for inviting me here today. I'll keep it to 5 minutes. I have condensed speaking notes. I did send my brief Wednesday evening, and I'll be highlighting some key points for everyone today. I apologize. My dog is sleeping, and you may hear him snoring. When I refer to some terms here today, I simply mean them in their legal sense as opposed to a stigmatizing way. I'm sorry, I see a hand up, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to respond to it.
Mr. Moore, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just a concern. We have a panel here, a full panel, and we have 1 hour sessions. So I heard you mention 35 minutes, which would cut short what we're able to hear from these panelists. So I just don't, people are taking the time to be on this panel The expectation we had when the notice went out was that we would have 1 hour with this panel, and 35 minutes isn't going to cut it when you look at the discussion we just had on the last panel. So I think I would like to hear from these witnesses in a fulsome way. I don't mean to cut in anyone's time, but I just heard you say 35 minutes when we're scheduled for an hour.
Or I brought this up in the beginning of the session. There's some housekeeping afterwards, so it was for that. I can push it and stretch it, and if our colleagues are willing to stay on a few minutes longer, maybe I can take this to 2:45, and then we can do the housekeeping in the last 15, 20 minutes. I don't expect to be long, but I always have to warn a little farther and to get the time constraints to be done. But I brought it up in the beginning. You may not have been on the.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, but we don't have any committee business scheduled. So housekeeping usually would take maybe 5 minutes. So, we're here today to hear from witnesses, not to, we didn't have any housekeeping scheduled. So I'd like to hear from witnesses. So if you can minimize, hopefully whatever housekeeping there is wouldn't take more than 3 or 4 minutes so we can maximize our witness time.
I will do my best. Thank you. I'll resume your time, Ms. Sayers, so you may resume.
Thank you. I had 41 seconds on my clock. So I just want to say that I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all here today and that we all agree in protecting victims and survivors of violence is important. It is very clear, however, that we disagree on the best route to take in terms of ending violence against women and girls, particularly Indigenous women and girls. I think it is also important to recognize whether we are talking about the New Zealand model or the Nordic model, we are talking about regulation of prostitution. PSEPA also assumes to target prostitution or full service sex work. And while the DOJ attempts to target other kinds of sex work, we have heard very little about the impact of PSEPA on other kinds of sex work, like stripping. I speak here today from lived experience, having worked in various parts of Canada in some states, and I have both experience as an escort in an agency and independent and as a stripper. I think a personal story is helpful to understand my experiences as a sex worker. When I first started speaking out about my experiences as a sex worker, I took a lot of risk in doing so. The first risk is that now I'm out as someone who has done sex work forever. There's no taking that back. The second risk is that oftentimes people have used my sex working experiences to silence me. I've had semi-nude and nude photos saved by those who do not agree with me, and my sex working identity has been linked to my real identity, or what is often called being outed or outing of a sex worker. The risks are very real: loss of privacy, safety, and security. I live in fear today that these images can and will be used against me to further target my privacy, safety, and security. When this outing happened, I called the police and I had little to no recourse. No charges were laid. The police did not know how to handle this complaint, nor did they have any knowledge about the harms it had caused me. I felt very alone and isolated. Today, I am a lawyer, and I contrast this with an experience being a lawyer recently. I was in the middle of a bail hearing. In that bail hearing, I received an email from an individual who had been saving my selfies. Nothing sexual about them, over the course of about 2 years, and sent them to me along with a very sexually explicit email. I felt violated. I continued to do my job as a defense lawyer, but by the end of the hearing, I sat around near the end of court waiting for a guard to appear. I asked if I could speak to him. We went to the room to discuss privately, and I immediately broke down crying. I showed him the email, and he took it very seriously. He took detailed notes and let me know that the police would follow up with me, and they did. I had to hire my own investigator, and I hired one who works with sex workers because I had a sense this might be a former client. We couldn't find any other identifying information other than that the person lived in the States, or likely lived in the States. The only difference between those two events is that I was a lawyer, and suddenly resources were whipped up and I was believed, with all the harms affirmed and acknowledged. I share this story to contrast how those who may identify as a sex worker, whether current or former, that the idea of justice is very much out of reach, and PSEPA also contributes to same. With this being said, I'd like to draw your attention to the part of my brief under the heading of quantitative and qualitative analysis. I think similar discussions are happening here today about data and who benefits, who doesn't benefit, but Bedford was clear. that the analysis into a charter infringement does not consider how many people are saved by a likely charter non-compliant bill or law. So how much a population benefits is of no concern to the charter analysis, nor how well a law achieves its objectives. It seems that the comments from the government branch tasked with proposing and drafting this legislative response to Bedford at all material times knew or ought to have known that the legislation was or is not compliant with the spirit and intent of Bedford. It also appears that this committee is imputing that this data and ancillary benefits matter to how well PSEPA achieves its objectives and how much a population benefits. Bedford made this clear that this does not matter in a Section 7 charter analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sayers. Next, Ms. Kelsey Smith from Carleton.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I'm here to talk to you about my lived experience with human trafficking. I was born to teenage parents, and growing up with parents who are still growing up themselves comes with its own form of challenges. Up until my parents' divorce, I was a good student who for the most part, kept out of trouble. Once my parents split, the tides changed. I went into grade 4 at a new school with a teacher who made a point to pick on me. I was also now competing for my parents' attention in their dating lives. I ended up living with my mother and stepfather, and it didn't seem to matter what I did. I was always labeled as wrong and a liar. The more I acted out, the less anyone seemed to care. After some time, I got what I wanted, and I moved in with my father, but he had already moved on to have more children and a new marriage, and my rebellious pattern of behavior was not welcome in his home. After some time, I moved in with my grandmother and went to a new high school in the city. In that first week of high school, I met a group of girls, and in the beginning, I was mocked for being the least experienced in the group. I started experimenting with drugs, and about a week into school, I was already skipping all of my classes. My newfound friends would brag about their initiation into gangs. They introduced me to drugs, smoking, and alcohol abuse. We weren't just partying on weekends, it was every day. One fall day, it all came to a screeching halt, and I'll never forget the first time I was trafficked. Some of my friends picked me up at my house on a Saturday morning. Immediately after, I threw up, and I was met with mockery. As time went on, I accepted my new fate. And one day when I was sitting with a few girls, there was a bunch of drugs on the gun on the table in front of me. One of the girls picked up the gun and pointed it at my head, and she asked if I thought anybody would care if I died, because now I was just a prostitute. That Christmas, I woke up in a drug house to people banging on the door looking for their fix. The next few months are a blur. I was addicted to drugs and constantly on the move. The last weekend I was trafficked. I was beaten pretty badly, but I was put right back to work. Not one person cared that I had 2 black eyes, a broken nose, and my lips were so swollen and bruised that I couldn't close my mouth. I was no longer seen as a person. I was just a shell. The next time I went home to get cleaned up, there were police officers and a social worker waiting for me to take me to a group home. At that moment, I didn't feel like I was being saved. I was terrified. I was going out of the city, and only the staff knew my history. I got a fresh start with rules, stability, and people who cared about me, and then I thrived. Years later, I learned that not only the group home, but my family were told that I was involved in prostitution. I was groomed to believe that I was making a choice at 14 years old. There was no justice. I didn't get to take action with the people who sold me or the people who bought me. I wasn't really given an option, and I didn't feel protected. I'm one of the lucky ones who can stand before you now and tell you that my life couldn't be more different. I survived. It took me years to reconcile with the fact that I was trafficked, and those years of self-discovery were wrapped in trauma. But I did find my worth, and I'm now a mother of 2 beautiful daughters, and as much as my job to fiercely protect them, I wonder whose job it is to protect the girls like me who were lost without anyone to advocate for them. Our lives are valuable. And I just very strongly feel like none of us would put our money in the bank without a security system. So why would you allow our lives to be stolen from us without repercussions? I guess I didn't fill my 5 minutes, so I'm good.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Next to Ms. Smiley from the Women's Studies Online for 5 minutes.
All right. I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is about the construction of knowledge. The second is about the source of harm in prostitution. And the third is what I learned from doing research for 3 months in New Zealand. Our default way of thinking about the world is patriarchal. And unless we've sought out feminist theories and are constantly working to unlearn the lies we've been taught, this is the frame we use to understand the world. This means that the majority of you use a patriarchal framework to understand prostitution. Prior to 1983, men in Canada could rape their wives without penalty because Canada had decided that men, husbands, were entitled to sex acts and that women, wives, were obligated to provide those sex acts. Rape in marriage was criminalized because feminists fought for it to be. Feminists knew that men weren't entitled to sex acts and that women weren't obligated to provide those sex acts. So I'm going to show you a little thing here. Here's one way to think about social issues. At the base, we have foundational values and beliefs. These foundational values influence our vision and what strategies we use to make change. If we look at an example of prostitution versus sex work, we can see the very different.
S'il vous plaît, j'ai un point d'ordre là.
Mr. Chair, I do want to hear the witness. I'm very happy with this presentation, but this document is not translated into French, and we have regulations and rules. It should be in both official languages. I understand that this has not been translated. We do not have a version in English and French, right?
Mr. Fortin, you are right, but she is going along with it, and I think translation is coming.
On va l'avoir prochainement.
Will we have this translated?
That slide, we could have that translated, yes.
Yes, I can send these in.
Absolutely.
Ce serait important que le témoin comprenne.
It's very important for the witness to understand that we're not supposed to use documents or props if they are not translated in both official languages. Everyone who is watching us or listening to us must be able to understand what is happening. Some people cannot read English. All documents must be in both official languages. I just would like to remind this to the witness with all due respect. Exceptionally, I will accept this, and I hope we will get the document by Monday or Tuesday in French. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And to the witness, if you could just make a copy of that afterwards, send it to the clerk. It'll be translated and shared with the rest of the committee. And I appreciate your tolerance of this, Mr. Fortin. Thank you. And you may resume. I have paused your clock, so you haven't lost any time.
Okay, thank you. So I'll skip ahead here. So if you believe sex is work, then you believe that men are entitled to sex acts from women and that women are obligated to provide sex acts to men. Instead of in marriage, however, now the context is prostitution. This is how the idea of sex work is inherently patriarchal. My second point is about the source of harm in prostitution. The source of harm in prostitution are the men and the sex acts they demand from women. Additional harms include being stabbed, shot, beaten, and so on. I'm sure there's days when many of you don't feel like coming to work and performing your job duties, but you do because you don't want to get fired and because you need to get paid. When we decide that sex is work, this means that there are women coming into their workplaces not wanting to perform their job duties, but doing so anyways, because they don't want to get fired and because they need to get paid. Only these job duties are unwanted sex acts, such as blowjobs and anal penetration, instead of filing reports or attending meetings. Women who engage in sex acts with men they do not sexually desire are harmed mentally, emotionally, and physically. We call this rape or sexual assault, and the exchange of money or goods doesn't change this. Women in prostitution are not a special kind of human that can handle things other humans can't. Lastly, I want to speak about the research I did in New Zealand. I learned that sex work works. Only it works to uphold male domination and female subordination. The New Zealand model is the model for you if you want to shamelessly encourage and facilitate men to exploit and profit from women's inequality. I also learned that prostitution is so embedded in the culture and landscape of Aotearoa that it's a non-issue. This has happened for many reasons. One being that when prostitution was being debated prior to the adoption of the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, the feminist argument that prostitution is a form of male violence against women was dismissed as being useless, when actually a feminist understanding of male violence against women is essential to understanding prostitution. Knowing that feminists were not heard in the debates leading up to New Zealand's celebrated Prostitution Reform Act gives more context to the present day silence surrounding prostitution in the country. This should be cause for great concern, as women's sex-based equality concerns were and are dismissed as irrelevant when it comes to prostitution in New Zealand. And the current regime there reflects this. For example, there are no exiting services in New Zealand. Why would there be? In New Zealand and elsewhere, sex work advocates do not understand male violence against women and how it functions. We can see this clearly when sex work advocates regurgitate the lie that women can tell which man will be violent and which man won't through the use of unspecified screening tools. Whether women screen for 2 minutes on the street, a week on a dating app, or for 10 years in a relationship, women cannot tell which man will be violent and which man won't. To say she can ultimately blames her if male violence is committed against her because she failed to screen properly. To get rid of PSEPA is short-sighted and anti-woman. Gillian Abel, a sex work researcher, has stated that sex work policies, quote, tend to focus on the outcomes of social inequality, rather like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. We need to keep and strengthen PSEPA. Women in Canada deserve nothing less.
Thank you. I'll now go to my first round of questions for Mr. Morrison for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the panelists today, the first hour and for our second hour panelists. You know, it's really important for us as parliamentarians to be able to get information on academia, on researchers, on analysts, victim services groups, but it's heartwarming to hear the personal stories. And Ms. Smith, your adventure in life that it was so horrific is really heartwarming. And I'm so glad you decided to attend today and share your story, which is really difficult to listen to, actually, to be honest with you. And I do want to ask you, a question, and I guess it's to deal with, from your experience, and it's so important for us to hear that life experience for people who have actually, gone through some problems within the sex trade, as in trafficking or as in violence. But from your experience, if we were to eliminate these laws or laws like it, do you think that vulnerable victims, I guess like yourself when you were younger, do you think vulnerable victims would be safer or more protected than they are now?
I honestly, that's a very hard question, because I do agree in some respects to what people were saying before about how some people aren't willing to come forward as much if they're criminalized when they see something that they that obviously shouldn't be happening, or that when they would be less likely to report a youth. But I really strongly believe that just even upholding laws that people wouldn't be allowed, I feel like it's just having these laws would deter people in the first place from seeking out sex work, which I think when you take away some of the demand, I think it'll, the people who trafficked me wouldn't have had a market to do so.
Okay, thanks so much. And I'll just, one quick follow-up question to that is, do you feel, or what do you think we could do that would enhance PSEPA to help more people?
I do think that it's important for, especially for girls who, it did take me about 5 years to even recognize the patterns of trafficking in my own life. And so if I was trafficked before even it was this law was passed. So it would have just given me an option to even just hold anyone accountable for what happened to me. And I just think that it's just really important for girls just to feel safe. So I do think, I'm sorry, I'm kind of botching your question. I'm not really sure what to add to it. Just maybe some more bridging between this and like human trafficking, because I do know there is such a strong correlation.
Perfect. And I do think too, we've had lots of different witnesses come before us on the PSEPA review, and there's really a difference in how police across Canada are enforcing or looking at PSEPA, and I can certainly see some improvements on educating police and those and having standardized enforcement, that sort of thing. I can see that being a move forward. I wonder if Ms. Smiley, if I could ask you, I guess one of the same questions, and that is, because we always want to know how can we do things better. How could we improve PSEPA?
There's a few ways that could happen. One is that we know that PSEPA hasn't been applied consistently across the country. So there's lots of areas, for example, Vancouver, City of Vancouver, where that has been, the police force has said this is the lowest priority. We're basically not going to enforce these laws. So I think that there needs to be actual enforcement of the laws to begin with. Secondly, we really do need to look at this holistically. I am an Indigenous woman. I do come from a background of being raised by my grandmother and understanding things in a more kind of holistic manner. So once we have that law where we're criminalizing the demand, that's a great step. But we need to have more options for women. So welfare rates are abysmal, lack of housing, women's poverty, all of these issues are very interconnected and they cannot be separated from prostitution. So we really need to be putting more money into services for women and their children. And lastly, to have a proper, solid public education campaign, as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of people don't understand prostitution in a way that is feminist. So it's understood in a way that it's just a normal, natural part of life. And so we really need to do some education to begin to undo those myths and really kind of get to the heart of prostitution.
If I know you mentioned, I only have about 30 seconds left. I know you mentioned that we, you looked at the New Zealand model. How do you think Canada would fare out if we totally dropped PSEPA and never had any enforcement at all?
Horrible, absolutely horrible. There it is just, it's so embedded. It's like going to the grocery store, this idea that it's totally okay to buy women and girls. There's lots of Maori women and girls who are still out there, who are still on the street. You see women being brought in from Asian countries. It's a mess.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I ran out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you, Ms. Smiley. Mr. Nakvi for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to direct my questions to Ms. Sayers. Thank you very much for appearing. And I may just pick up where Mr. Morrison left in terms of looking at the New Zealand model as well. But before I do that, can I ask a question to you in terms of your suggestions or recommendations to us as a committee as to what you think we should do with PSEPA?
Right. So I think it's really important that we turn our minds to Bedford and what Bedford had said, and because Bedford was very clear on what Parliament could do or could not do, and the DOJ turned around and said, "Hey, look, we made it compliant with Bedford. And now we're having this review and we're saying, look at all this data, look at all these great benefits, but that's not what Bedford says is applicable. So if we look at the intent, right, the intent informs all of the law. So you have to really look at what is the intent that we're doing. And Senator Plett, he admitted, he goes, we don't want to make it safe. We want to do away with prostitution. And with that comes a corollary that people will lose their lives. So, and in Bedford, the evidence there was also dead sex workers.
So is it your advice to us that we repeal PSEPA in its
Yes,
entirety?
that is correct. Yes, that is correct. I don't think that there will be any gaps, because what Ms. Davis had said earlier was that the police need the tools to sort of rely on the other provisions that are there in the code. She didn't say that word for word, but she alluded to it in that way.
We've seen quite often in this committee, and we saw some testimony in this panel as well, where sex works and human trafficking is conflated. Can you, from your experience as somebody, as you mentioned, was a sex worker and as a lawyer, now can you highlight the differences between the two, and how do we bring regard to those differences, those who are sex workers by choice and those who may be human trafficked?
Right. So we have to remember that I said this in 2014, that choice, is such a complicated topic, and people make different choices every single day for many reasons, and the context in which those choices are made vary. But in terms of what we have here today is we have these laws that sort of, I don't think that they help make prosecution of human trafficking easier. And I don't think that they help sex workers, because it captures some of their activities. One example would be living and working in the same space. And then it also, if somebody were also driving their friend, that would also potentially capture, is that human trafficking or not? And then we get into this debate about which laws applies and which don't. And then it makes the job hard for the prosecutors. And so we have to remember that those roles are very important too. In terms of human trafficking, we need to, like my co-panelist here, Ms. Smiley, was saying, we need to support the issues before they get there. This law is what Ms. Davis was saying is a reactive law. It's not a proactive law.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question in terms of the New Zealand model. I don't know if you've had the chance to look at the legislative scheme there. Just generally speaking, what are your thoughts on what New Zealand is doing?
Right. So you have to remember New Zealand is a unitary state, right? So in Canada, we have a blessing and a curse where we have federal, provincial, regional, municipal, then First Nations. You have a lot of, different contexts for how sex work may look in different regions, because how it looks in Toronto isn't the same how it looks in Northern Ontario, right? So I think to say, should we adopt the New Zealand model? It's too simple. There needs to be a much more informed approach that this committee takes. But I just would like to correct the record. Migrant workers are targeted in New Zealand. And if you look at the previous briefs that were submitted, especially by Jamie Liu, Canadian Lands for Sex Work Law Reform, that people don't just get brought in and brought there to work freely. It's they are targeted as well.
So I'm hearing a bit of caution from you also, that if we look at New Zealand model, that we have to look at it in the context from Canadian perspective and the differences that exist in Canada and New Zealand, not just in terms of our constitutional status, but also lived experience. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yes, that is correct. And I think my brief, which I did file on Wednesday evening, does draw attention to sort of the soup of regulations that target, the sex trade in terms of municipal regulations, what's unregulated, what's not regulated, what's legalized, what's not legalized. So I think we really need to, take a step back and remove ourselves from this New Zealand model approach. I'm not saying don't decriminalize, but I'm just saying the New Zealand model oversimplifies things.
Yeah. Good caution, and thank you for sharing that with us. I've got very limited time. So my last question for you will be, if one to decriminalize in Canada, and of course health and safety of sex workers is paramount, what will be your one key advice to us that we should consider as we develop recommendations?
Sorry, I just want to, can you just clarify the question?
What's your takeaway message
Sorry.
for us?
Yeah, so I think a takeaway message is, I think just a quick personal story was I was stabbed at work as a stripper. I couldn't turn to the Victim Compensations Board, which no longer exists in Ontario. It's been reformatted by Premier Ford because they said that, you know, if you're engaging in criminal activity at the time, you couldn't access it. And I think that's a perfect example of why decrim is so important.
Thank you, Mr. Naqvi. And now for 6 minutes to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I will continue with you, if I may, Ms. Sawyers. I understand from your testimony that we should decriminalize the sex trade. But if we completely decriminalize it, we do know that offering or selling sex services is not criminal, but it's criminal to buy sex services. So we're criminalizing people's soliciting, and we criminalize anyone living on the avails of the sex trade, the pimp or the person procuring. So the procurement of persons for the purpose of prostitution is illegal. So if we take all that out and say it's totally legal to prostitute yourself, to procure the persons for the purpose of prostituting them, to buy these services, and so on and so forth, don't you fear that we'll wind up in a deplorable situation, the sort of situation that Ms. Smith was sharing with us a few moments ago? Of course, a minor, it's always a criminal matter, of course. I'm sure you're not asking us to decriminalize the prostitution of minors. That, nevertheless, even an 18-year-old person, if we allow for free sex trade, like any other business, aren't you concerned that we'll wind up with other cases like this where the body of a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, will be sold and people will make money and live on the avails of the sale of the body of someone else?
Phrase your question. I didn't get a question out of that. It seemed more like a
Est-ce que
statement.
vous n'êtes pas inquiète si...
If we decriminalize, if we drop all criminalization of any activities around prostitution, don't you think we should be concerned that we would wind up commodifying the bodies of young men and young women, young or not young?
I thank my co-panelist, Ms. Smith, for sharing her story. I understand it takes a lot of strength to do that. So I'd like to turn the attention to my brief, which I did outline that, you know, whether we're talking about decriminalization, legalization, we're talking about regulation of prostitution in some way. And Bedford had said, you can regulate prostitution, but you can't do so at the expense of sex workers. And, you know, exactly, you can support victims and survivors of exploitation, but you can't do it at the expense of sex workers. So if we were to, so hypothetically remove the laws tomorrow, there are other laws that are on the book that the police can turn to. And what Ms. Davis had said earlier is that let's support the police. I can't believe I'm saying that, in terms of helping them, you know, implement those laws, right? So the tools are there. Let's use them.
Okay. Et quand vous nous parlez...
Very well. As for the New Zealand model, you're saying that it would have to be adapted to the Canadian context. All right, that makes sense. But what, according to you, should be used from that model here? I've got about a minute and a half left, so I'd like to know what is worth lifting, retaining from the New Zealand model in a Canadian model?
What was important in the New Zealand model was that they heard directly from sex workers. And I think in the implementation of PSEPA, that has been like horribly missed in terms of the implementation of SAME. And we have to, like I said, return to Bedford. What does it say? What does it tell Parliament it can and cannot do? And it says exactly, you can regulate prostitution, but you can't do it at the expense of sex workers.
Ça, c'est l'avocate qui parle.
All right, that's the lawyer speaking. I was hoping I would hear the person, Ms. Sawyers, because obviously we're all aware of the Bedford ruling. But you have a better experience of New Zealand from your point of view based on your prior activities in this sector, striptease and prostitution. So that lived experience likely leads you to a very helpful opinion, not necessarily the lawyer's opinion. I'd like to hear the opinion of Naomi Sawyers, not necessarily Maître Sawyers.
So I'm not giving a lawyer opinion. I think it's very important that we turn what our mind in Bedford says, because I think that we're moving away from that each time we go to the data, each time we go to the ancillary benefits. And I think that's the harm, and we're moving away from what Ms. Lukings had said, what Ms. Davis had says, what Andrea and Dr. I don't remember, I can't see her name, what her co-panelists had said. The data is very clear in that regard. And Bedford had said one person is enough to satisfy that it's not charter compliant. But in terms of my own personal story, I've shared a couple personal stories already today, and the police refused to help me. And the systems that were set up when it's criminalized, I wasn't able to access the supports. So I think it's very clear that when you do criminalize any aspect of sex work and target it, you're further alienating and isolating the workers.
Merci, Madame Sawyers.
Thank you, Mr. Fortin. And now for 6 minutes, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today. In particular, I want to thank Ms. Smiley for reminding us that the growing inequalities in Canadian societies are a constant context with all issues that we deal with. And I want to thank Ms. Smith for her telling her personal story here in a very public forum. It takes an enormous amount of strength to do so. And I know that it will inspire others who have been exploited or may have been exploited to do better things in their lives. So I want to ask Ms. Smith, in one of your answers, you said you thought perhaps the criminalization would prevent reporting of instances of exploitation. Can you just say a bit more about that, and maybe related to your own? Because things are criminalized, people won't report when they see exploitation?
Yeah, for sure. I will kind of speak to, I did hear that some people have like regular clientele because they have been doing sex work for a long time. But I actually kind of had the same experience, it was continuously the same people that I was seeing, but they weren't reporting anything. I don't know if it was because it was criminalized. I don't know if it's because they didn't care. I don't know like what their reasoning was. But I did see the same clientele numerous times. And it was like, I was a 14-year-old girl, and no one seemed to speak up about it.
So there was, when you said at the one time you went home, there were police and social workers waiting for you. Yeah. Was that because someone had reported the exploitation?
No, it was,
don't share any details. I'm not asking you to share details.
No, I was 14 and I was no longer going to high school. So at some point, social services, I guess, steps in and realizes that. So it took about I would say about 8 months for them to realize that I had dropped out of high school as a 14-year-old girl, and I was reported to social services, and then they did a little more digging into what was going on.
Okay, so those other regulations that actually brought this to the attention of social workers.
Yes.
Okay, I want to turn to Ms. Sayers, and I'm going to ask you a question from a perspective that I don't share, but we've heard several times when sex workers who are relatively successful, who live in urban areas, have given testimony to us. Others say, well, this is just a few privileged sex workers or just a few people in urban areas who hold these opinions about sex work. And how do you respond to that attempt to undermine your testimony?
Right. That's a really good example. And I'll share a story from law school. I was sitting in law school constitutional litigation class, and I was working on a theoretical challenge to Bill C-36, PSEPA, what we're here today. And we were building our fact pattern. And I remember my constitutional law prof, he says, that doesn't happen. And I said, yes, it does. And what he was referring to was my personal experiences where working in the northern region, you have to have a driver. If you don't have a driver, you will be hitchhiking. There's no Greyhound bus, there's no cabs. Cabs will not bring an Indigenous person anywhere unless they charge exorbitant fees, which, you know, if you do the research out there, the cabs will even drop off Indigenous women in particular in spots where they're not they didn't ask to be brought to. So I said, you know, PSEPA prevents Indigenous women, in particular, young Indigenous women, from having those supports. The reason I talk about my story so much is because it's not heard. It's not considered. I entered when I was 18. I was still in high school. I was learning to live with a brain injury. I just survived a horrible car accident, almost died. And I was working 2 minimum wage jobs. And when you have a brain injury, you have headaches, migraines, you're tired. And I was like, I can't achieve my education goals to go to university if I'm working 2 minimum wage jobs. And I was not living at home, and sex work was there. So, you know, if you attack minimum wage, if you attack safe housing, if you attack all those other supports, maybe I'm never would have went into sex work. I don't know, but you know, it got me out. It led me to where I am today, a lawyer, and I help other victims and survivors. And I think that's key.
So in your experience, would you say that the opinion that PSEPA should be repealed in its entirety is broadly shared among those who are working in the sex industry?
So I think there's disagreements about how
I don't know if her screen, Ms. Sayers, is your screen frozen? Maybe you can mute and unmute or turn the screen on and off. The camera on and off. Mr. Garrison, would you want to ask a question to somebody else? I've frozen your time. You have about 40 seconds or so.
Let's just, I'm sorry we have this unfortunate technical problem, but let's just proceed.
Okay. I will go over to you, Mr. Brock, for 5 minutes.
Help if I unmute myself. Thank you to the our second panel for your evidence today and your cooperation throughout, and a special thank you to Ms. Smith for sharing a very personal and difficult story for us. I want to thank you for sharing that. I share the comments of my colleague, Mr. Morrison. It was very, very difficult to hear that, and it reminded me of similar cases that I prosecuted not too long ago of similar young persons in your circumstances. And thank you for being a positive role model to your children moving forward. So question actually to Ms. Smiley. Ms. Smiley, I had an opportunity of reviewing a piece that you wrote with a Tricia Baptiste. It was titled Quebec City Murder Underscores Need to Abolish Prostitution. And with the time I have permitting, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. First question, in your view, can prostitution be made safe?
No. In my view, prostitution cannot be made safe. And this is because the inherent harm of prostitution is engaging in unwanted sex acts with men that you don't want to have sex with. That happens way more commonly than where women are wanting to engage. And so that being in that circumstance where you're engaged in unwanted sex acts over and over and over and over and over, outside of prostitution, we call that rape or sexual assault. And we act as if this exchange of money or goods somehow negates that impact on women, and it doesn't.
Thank you. What do you say to those, and we've heard from several of these individuals, those who support the full decriminalization of prostitution as a way to make the industry safer?
I'd say totally misguided, a total lack of understanding of male violence against women and how it actually functions in the culture that we live in today. It's not possible to make it safer. Women who go in, I think, may have different ideas about what it's going to be like, but the impact of having sex with men that you don't want to have sex with every day, multiple times a day, that is going to have an impact on you physically, mentally, emotionally, and that's the heart. That's what prostitution is. So you can't make that. You can't make rape or sexual assault safer.
And my last question to you is the article that I referenced. You make a point of saying that in 2014, Canada partially adopted the Nordic model, and you specifically indicate that Canada has failed to adopt the entire model and to consistently implement the law as it stands now. The country has yet to adopt or implement robust social services and public education. So on that particular point, what recommendations would you make?
I think a solid, good recommendation, and I know there's been rumblings about this for years, is to have a guaranteed livable income. So to actually have, people in Canada have the income that they need to survive. If we were to have, I live in Vancouver, housing here is ridiculous. If we were to actually implement measures so that everybody had a house to live in, if we had, services for women who have experienced male violence, even now there's wait lists for counseling and these types of things. So it really is addressing those inequalities and doing that in a substantial way. And I think that if we do that, more often than not, when women are presented with more choices, they generally don't choose, sucking dicks for a living. And so if we set women up to succeed, I think that that is what will happen.
Okay, thank you. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have about 40 seconds.
Question to Ms. Sayers. Ms. Sayers, I hope I heard you correctly in the narrative that you gave in the first 5 minutes, that there was a disconnect with the legislation and the act of stripping. Can you expand upon that?
No, I was just commenting on that. The legislation, while the DOJ, on their summary cites about what this bill targets, the law and all these discussions that we're having here today, it just presumes to target prostitution, which is full service sex work, which would only include sort of, indoor or outdoor street-based sex work. But we're not talking about other kinds of sex work. We're not talking about stripping. We're not talking about, all those other kinds of the way that sex workers engage in work. And I think we're missing those important pieces as well, because the police also are in those spaces, and there are surveillance of workers in those spaces.
Thank you, Ms. Sawyer. Thank you, Mr. Brock. Now for Ms. Briard for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci à tous les témoins d'être ici.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses. It's not easy to provide that kind of testimony, and I would like to recognize your resiliency and the strength of character that you have. A question for Ms. Sawyers. Up to now, we've heard from those who are for decriminalization that only those who are privileged wanted decriminalization because it's among the marginalized that criminalization has the biggest impact or the harshest impact, and I'd like to hear you on that.
Thank you, and I apologize if my internet cuts out. I'm on my cellular data, so it's kind of shaky. So we have to remember that, I think my brief draws out some really good assumptions as to how the law treats particularly Indigenous women. It makes assumptions about who we are, and it makes assumptions about what we do, right? So when I walk into a mall, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an Indigenous woman, and I will experience racism as an Indigenous woman, and I will experience surveillance as an Indigenous woman. When I walk into a courtroom, a new courtroom, if the court security doesn't recognize me, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an Indigenous woman, and they will assume that I'm there for a case to be a client, and I'm probably one of the persons charged, right? So we have to remember that that's how the law treats Indigenous women. That's how the law sees Indigenous women, and most importantly, that's how society sees Indigenous women. So we have to look at what this law does and doesn't do, right? But we also have to remember that Bedford said, look, one person means that this if one life is lost under this law, that's sufficient. We don't say how many people benefit. We don't say whether it benefited one or two people. If one life is lost, that's it. And we've heard here today that there have been 7. There's been many, and I think that's what we need to focus on.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. What do you think the impact of decriminalization would have on health, rights, and safety of people who work in the sex industry?
Yes, so I think the one example that I said to your co-committee member, I don't know how to say his name correctly. He's from Quebec, or I can't remember who I said it to, but I was talking about where I was stabbed at work. I was a stripper, and I was stabbed at work, and I was stabbed by another stripper. I couldn't call the police because I knew that the other stripper was a single mother. So I knew that if I called the police, that she would also be harmed. Her children would be harmed. So I took myself to the hospital. I didn't call the police because I knew that I would also be harmed as an Indigenous woman. I couldn't apply to the Victims' Compensation Board because the law could see my work as, being criminalized. And so I didn't have access, didn't have support. And under Ontario legislation, OSHA, no recourse whatsoever. Decriminalization would help with that.
Merci. Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I must have time for one more question. A question for Ms. Smiley. The police or municipal authorities, do they have a different attitude related to the application of the legislation towards Aboriginal people or people who are marginalized?
I think in general, race definitely plays a role. But I think we see with male violence across the board, so whether women are in prostitution or not, there's often a problem. Well, she asked for it. We see these issues of sexism. And I do want to point out, when I was in the Netherlands, actually, I was speaking with a worker there who was, going around to the women in the windows, and was told about a case where a woman had been assaulted, had went to the police, went through the court process, and the judge was actually a client of hers. And so I think that we need to be thinking about this as well. If we're going to do total decriminalization, are police allowed then to just go and do this on their breaks, and judges and decision makers, city councilors? How does that impact us as as people in Canada? I think that's something that's important to think about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Briere. Thank you to all the witnesses for your excellent testimony. It's been very informative, and this whole study has been informative, and all of you have contributed immensely to the study. I'll now, you're more than welcome to stay on, but as panelists, as you can zoom off if you want. I just have some housekeeping, and I apologize to Mr. Moore. My own perceptions of time are not exactly accurate because of my noviceness in this position, so I had estimated perhaps 30 minutes. Probably shouldn't take that long. So as you know, Bill C5 has been referred to the committee, and we have an obligation to study that. And so I was just getting some instructions as to committee business. I think as of Monday, we were having our scheduled next study for PSEPA. The goal is for the first hour to have the witnesses come and attend, and the last hour for drafting instructions. And then I believe Mr. Nansangari has some information in regards to the minister appearing and department officials for Bill C5 on Friday. So sorry, I shouldn't have said Monday. It was Tuesday, PSEPA, first hour witnesses, second hour drafting instructions, and then Bill C5, the study with respects to that, assuming on Thursday.
Mr. Chair, we're proposing about 5 meetings for C5, followed by clause, and maybe a deadline for witnesses proportionate to how we usually do it. So maybe witness list to be provided by next Wednesday around noon. And then the minister and the officials are available for next Friday, April the 8th.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Fortin.
About C5, in my opinion, we have to be diligent. We shouldn't delay anything. That being said, in C5, there are 2 separate issues that are completely different. There's the it has to do with the consumption of certain drugs and mandatory minimums. These are 2 separate topics. Maybe you'll remember after first reading, it was asked to the Minister of Justice to separate C5 or to make 2 different bills to accelerate processing so that we can focus on not going through the courts. The concern that I had at first when it was suggested that the bill be separated, and that concern is still real, I don't think that we'll be able to settle this in 5 meetings. I discussed this with my colleague, Mr. Nangari. I had a chat with a certain number of people around me, and what I suggest is that we need a bit of room to maneuver to have more meetings if needed, but I think that we would need 4 meetings about not going through the courts and 4 other meetings about mandatory minimums. That would mean 8 meetings and then 2 at the end for clause by clause. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, I see Mr. Garrison. If I'm going by my screen's order, I think you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm very supportive of your plan for next week. I'm very concerned that we get started on the drafting work so the drafters can work away while we're starting on the hearings on C5. I don't believe we can settle the question of number of meetings today in the time we have available to us, but I think you presented a good plan for next week. And I'm presuming in what you said, we have the minister and officials for the full 2 hours on the Friday, and that we're splitting the time on the Tuesday. So I am supportive of those suggestions. And maybe we can leave the total number of meetings to be discussed at another meeting. Thanks.
Just to be clear, I think the Friday meeting will be an hour for the minister and then departmental officials for the next hour. But it'll be 2 hours of minister and departmental officials. Mr. Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As usual, Mr. Garrison took the words right out of my mouth. We're so often on the same page, but I am inclined to agree with Mr. Garrison and what's been said about the number of meetings. I think 5, in my view, is going to be a little low when we're dealing with something that's having very sweeping changes. But I think generally what you've outlined is sound for our work on Tuesday, and then to have the minister appear on Friday. But I think we should defer on the total number of meetings for a future meeting.
Gary?
Mr. Chair, my only concern is as we embark on the study of C5, it will be good to have a sense at the outset how many witnesses we're talking about. So while I agree that we may not be able to resolve it today, I wonder if there is time to do a subcommittee meeting next week, early next week, so that we can actually hammer this out.
I think that would be a fair thing. We'll start with 5. We'll have a... Okay. Instead of a subcommittee, maybe perhaps we'll have a informal chat around with the each party's representatives, and we'll try to figure out a number. But at least we have next week's scheduled taken care of, and we'll tentatively start it at 5, and because we at least have a minimum agreement on that, and then we can, Mr. Moore, chat next week and figure out the course of it going forward. If that's okay with everyone? Do I see nods? Yes. Perfect. Okay, I think we have the agenda. I'll call this meeting to an end, and we'll see you all on Tuesday. Thank you.